Hello and welcome to IEEE Soft Robotics podcast. In this podcast, we're going to interview researchers from both academia and industry about their work, thoughts, spectrum, and more beyond that. This is Marwa ElDiwiny, and I hope you will find this podcast useful. If you would like to connect with us, simply send us, and we will be happy to hear from you. And here is my interview. Thanks.
Science and Systems Conference is now accepting applications to the Inclusion RSS program. Applications are due March 13th, 2020. The RSS community is committed to increasing the participation of groups traditionally underrepresented in robotics, including but not limited to women, LGBTQ+, underrepresented minorities, and people with disabilities. Inclusion RSS is a way to increase and sustain a broader participation in the robotics research community. This opportunity is especially for people early in their studies and career, and participants will receive travel support. You can find the application at roboticsconference.org under the Inclusion RSS page. Again, Inclusion RSS is now accepting applications until March 13th, 2020.
Welcome to IEEE Soft Robotics podcast. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning. My name is Michael Levin. I am the director of the Allen Discovery Center at Tufts University and a professor of biology. Mm-hmm. I'm also an associate faculty at the Wyss Institute at Harvard.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask you first how you define robotics, soft robotics, from your eyes as biologist.
Well, first, just to say that my primary job, I'm not a roboticist. I have a background in computer science, but for the last 20 or so years, I've been running a developmental biology lab. So I am not primarily a roboticist. But in my mind, soft robotics is the creation of machines with predictable kinds of behavior that are made of soft materials. So this is how I see things, but obviously there are other definitions that people in the field use.
Mm-hmm. So I'm interested about, because we know that about the living robot, the first living robot. If I'd ask you, what is actually a living robot, you can define for people who first time listened about what's living robot?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that our work does is highlight the fact that we actually do not have very crisp definitions of a lot of words that people use all the time. Mm-hmm. So people think they know what a machine is, what an animal is, what a robot is, what a body is, what evolutionary history is. All of these things we use in daily language all the time, but actually examples like this suggest that we really, as a community, need to do a lot more work to understand what are the most useful definitions of words like this. So, what I would say is that the constructs that we made, these Xenobots, are definitely living because they're made of living cells, and they do all of the activities that match most reasonable definitions of what life is. And they're a robot in the sense that their activity and their function is to some extent controllable by us. I mean, people have referred to insects as robots as well, and other types of animals. I mean, the what exactly a robot is nowadays, where both the technology and the programming has become very flexible, such that robots are no longer necessarily extremely sort of boring, predictable agents. The definition of robot is up for grabs, but basically it is a synthetic living machine in the sense that it is made of living cells. The whole organism is living, and we have some degree of programmability over what it does.
That's very interesting. I would like to go to your lab ultimate goal, because it's really interesting description you had about the top-down control of complex biological shape. And that's lead to, because in soft robotics somehow we're interested in integrating smart material in our robots. And now we have the cells, cellular robots from living cell. So how you see this kind of, this definition about shape and how it is important really to consider the morphology from this point of view, how it really matters so much in designing? This.
Yeah, so just to go back a step, the goal of our lab is really to understand how living tissue processes information. We want to understand computation that is performed by living organisms at all scale, to whole animals and organs and everything in between. And so that information comes in two flavors. There's information that comes in via learning and memory, and part of our lab does that and tries to understand how learning in brains and actually outside of brains in various tissues takes place. But some very important information in living things is structural, is anatomy. So if we sort of ask the question of where does anatomy come from, and we're all used to embryonic development and the idea that an egg can reliably give rise to cells that self-assemble into a very particular highly reliable anatomy. And then some animals are even able to regenerate. So if they get injured, they're able to recreate certain organs. Let's say salamanders, if they lose an arm, they can recreate the arm or eyes or tails, various other organs. And so the biggest puzzle in this field is how do the cells know what to build? How do they know what to build, and how do they know when to stop? Because when the cells rebuild a particular organ, such as an arm, then they stop when they have completed the creation of a correct salamander arm. Well, how do they know what a salamander arm is? And so for us, what we try to do is really to understand how cells store and manipulate the information that allows them to cooperate together to build large structures and maintain large structures. And these Xenobots are part of that effort, because this is our attempt to recreate the process from scratch. So we're really the goal for us, the goal of this work. I mean, there are many outcomes that would be useful, but one of the fundamental goals of this work is not just that we will have useful robots, but actually that we will understand how cells make decisions about very large things like organs and organ systems. And once we do that, we will actually be able to address all sorts of problems of regenerative medicine. So if you think about it, all of the problems of medicine basically boil down to control of shape. So birth defects, traumatic injury, tumor reprogramming, all of these things could be solved if we understood how cells make decisions. So for us, this is very much a computational problem, and the robotics is our attempt to test the theories that we have and to try to see if we really understand how this works and to improve our understanding of how cells control shape. And so shape will be critical for biomedicine, but also, of course, for robotics and even for things like communications networks, anywhere where the structure is critical to the function would be really important.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So it's all about understanding. That leads to a question about the structure of having skin and cell heart for the Xenobot. And what's really interesting, the emergent behavior that we saw, that when they have a swarming and they like move in different direction, and when they make constructions. So if there is like explanation, is there conscious how, because we know that the evolutionary organism can really suggest this structure, but when you go to the living structure, how it's done is like the properties of the cells. Is there an explanation why this happen, this emergent behavior?
Yeah, and I should say that what we show in this one paper that just came out is only the tip of the iceberg. We have a ton more data that's currently being written up, and of course lots more to do still, that will describe many more emergent behaviors that these things have. And one of the important aspects of this work right now is to really get a good computational modeling understanding of what it is that these cells are saying to each other that allows them to do this. Fundamentally, what we're talking about is exploiting cellular plasticity, not in the sense of stem cells, not in the sense of cells becoming different cell types, but actually cells in communication with other cells and forming collective cell groups or tissues that can make decisions about how they're going to pattern and how they're going to act. And what we've learned, and this is something we've been suggesting for a long time, but now this is a particularly, I think, interesting implementation of it, is that all cells, not just neurons, but all cells are really fundamentally quite intelligent signaling agents. This goes back to the time when we were all unicellular organisms and every cell had to do everything. It had to do behavior, physiology, survival, everything on its own. And body cells did not lose this ability. They still have this IQ, and they're able to now, however, get together and work as in groups towards much bigger goals, such as making something that moves or does other things in the environment. And so what we see is that these skin cells are communicating with each other. They communicate using electrical, chemical, and mechanical signals, and they communicate with each other to try to sort of reboot multicellularity. They find themselves together in a new configuration. They've been liberated from the constraints of the original embryo, and this is a chance for them to get together and build something else. And what we're finding out is that at least metazoan cells love to get together and cooperate towards building things, and that's what we're doing. So now it is time to really make very detailed computation models of what exactly the cells are saying to each other that allows them to pursue these kind of large-scale goals, and that's our major direction for this project going forward.
So here is a question about when you go from different scale like micro or macro levels, what is really important to be considered when you see this behavior? So it is really complex when you explain it or have a computational model in this level and you go into larger scale. It is the same scenario or there is different consideration in that case?
Yeah, I think the biggest consideration here is not so much the actual size, but in fact the fact that we have nested scales, nested levels of organization. So one of the important things, I gave a talk once called "Why Robots Don't Get Cancer," and the reason robots don't get cancer is because in general all of our technology is made of fairly dumb parts. So if you have a robot, and hopefully the robot is a little bit intelligent, but mostly it's made of dumb parts, and we don't expect the parts to have their own goals. You hope the robot has some goals. But biology isn't like that. Biology has competency at every level. So you have swarms of organisms that have colony level goals. You have organisms that pursue goals. You have organs that have physiological goals. You have cells which have morphogenetic goals, and then you have molecular networks which have homeostatic goals. And all the way down, every layer is a minimal cognitive system that has the ability to take measurements, to take actions. Sometimes they have memory. They're able to pursue these local goals. And what the downside of this is that occasionally some of these goals will diverge from the goals of the level above it, and this is how you get cancer, is when a cell basically reverts back to a unicellular lifestyle where it stops participating in the cognitive structure of the body and becomes basically the self itself, its computational self shrinks down to the level of a single cell, and then there's cancer. And so the downside is this, and of course in today's robotics that doesn't happen. And so that's good, but the downside of not having it is that we are very limited in our robustness and our adaptability in the robotics. So one of the things life is very good at is at self-repair, at coming up with new solutions and novel problems, and in learning from very few examples. All of these things are, I think, a consequence of this multi-scale goal-directed architecture at every level. And so occasional defections like cancer are the price we pay for it, but I don't think there's any other way to get large-scale general intelligence or adaptive behavior. And so this is the big challenge here, is not so much the size, but actually these scales, and how do we create technology that has this sort of competency at every level, and then specifically what are the policies that we need to implement that would allow the lower level subunits and their goals to cooperate together towards larger scale goals. Biology has figured this out very well, and now we need to understand what those optimal policies are going to be.
That's very interesting, and I have a lot of questions, but here's a question. Since you said something very important about dump, and I would like to ask you first, do you think that the robotics community, especially soft robotics and application about surgical robotics and specifically, do you think that the direction have to be shifted to the solution? Because sometimes you have a technology which is not realistically can be applied to human body, and we have this kind of struggle why we do this kind of research. So do you think that's kind of awareness or understanding what is the optimum solution we have to come up with? And hence what we see that biology maybe have this answer. Do you think this something is like awareness issue, firstly, in research in this direction?
I think that the big thing that I would like people to have awareness of for this kind of work is that it is not specifically about having small robots do useful tasks. Obviously, that's part of it. We will have small robots that do useful tasks, but the bigger advance here is not that. The bigger advance in this field when it matures is that we are going to have a better understanding of how competent small subunits cooperate together towards large-scale goals. This is going to revolutionize everything from machine learning to the design of communication networks to robotics and swarm robotics, and of course biomedicine, with applications that may have nothing to do with the actual robots themselves, but just in understanding how you convince a pile of cells to do something medically useful. So the bigger advance here is actually computational. It's not about the physical body of the robots. It's about understanding how coordination and communication can be optimized for large scale outcomes. How to get basically programming swarms is the long range objective here, and this will have massive implications for the design of everything from communication networks to regenerative medicine.
So if we ask about the limitation of this Xenobots, what is the limitation already you have?
There are lots of limitations right now. So for immediate applications of the Xenobots themselves, some of the limitations are, for example, that right now we have to make them by hand. It's very sort of low throughput. It's time consuming. So one of the things we'd like to do is to develop methods to scale it up and to have it automated. Another limitation right now is that currently they don't eat, and so they have a limited lifespan. Now that's also a good safety feature in a certain sense, but inside the laboratory we would like to have these things live longer, so we're trying to figure out how to feed them. But the bigger conceptual limitation is that this is brand new work in the sense of trying to understand how the plasticity works. So we still do not have good conceptual frameworks for understanding how goals of smaller agents add up to the goals of larger agents when they get together. And in fact, where do the goals of larger agents come from in the first place is a very important problem in computer science. I would point out two things. One is that every decision is a group decision. There's no such thing as a unified agent that is not made of parts. We are made of parts. Our brains are made of individual cells. I mean, everything that we think of as a coherent single cognitive agent with goals is actually made of parts. And so understanding how pieces come together to have a cognitive structure, memory, and goals, and so on, that are integrated, that seem like they belong to one single agent, is the central puzzle, I think, of the philosophy of mind. Is to find out, how integrated cells arise from basically a bag of parts. What has to be the relationship between the parts, and so. So that's really crucial. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that we still don't really understand where goals and motivations come from. If you think about it, for a living system, it's pretty obvious how to motivate a living organism with rewards and punishments. Within a very short time frame, you look at a living system, you can figure out what it likes and what it doesn't like and what its preferences are. But actually, for any kind of an artificial agent, for a robot or a computer or an AI, this is completely not obvious. How would you reward or punish an AI? I mean, it's for a computer. I mean, you can have an algorithm that tries to force it to do specific things, but in fact, how you would motivate it, does a computer really, if it plays chess, does it actually care if it's going to win? And you could sort of pull the plug if it loses, but is that really kind of any kind of negative reinforcement on the computer? It's really not. They don't care. So this idea of where actual preferences and goals even come from is a major gap in our understanding. I don't think we're going to have generalized intelligence until we solve this problem. And it's also a major problem. People ask a lot about the kind of risk aspects of this work, and including of robotics and AI in general. I think part of where the risk comes from is that we don't know where goals come from. So if you have an Internet of Things, or you have a new artificial intelligence, or some sort of giant communications and control network, what is it going to want? I mean, we have absolutely no idea how to figure out in advance how to predict goal states for complex agents. And so this is part of that work is to figure out where preferences come from when new agents are created from swarms of smaller agents.
And for navigation as well, how this kind of control aspect for living cells, how you would, if you said that rewarding or punishing, how you would imagine this would be in case like a cancer treatment of finding tumor. How you imagine this would be inside a human body if we assuming that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have done quite a bit of work on this, and we're working very hard on this very problem. There are two ways that we're addressing it. Number one is that we've actually discovered how to read and write pattern memories, and this is basically what I mean by that is an encoded information structure in the tissues that tells the cells what they should be building. So, for example, in the case of a flatworm, we've discovered a bioelectric memory that literally tells the cells if they should be building one head or two and where these heads should be located. And it's pretty cool because you can go in and you can with a fairly brief electrical manipulation, you can rewrite this state. It's a stable, I call it a memory because it's a stable electrical state that persists over long periods of time, but it's actually like any good memory, it's actually rewritable. So you can alter this memory, and when you alter it and say instead of a normal one-headed pattern, you produce a two-headed pattern, the cells will happily build to that pattern. They basically consult they consult the memory and they build whatever it says, and so you can make two-headed worms and so on. And so we do this all the time in various model systems for our approaches to regenerative medicine. We ask if, let's say, if there's an incorrect pattern that's going to lead to a birth defect, or that prevents regeneration, or there's a tumor-like a bioelectric pattern that keeps the cells working independently instead of towards normal organogenesis, we can now in some cases rewrite that memory pattern, and the cells will build. So it's an approach not to rewire the hardware of the cells, but actually to provide inputs or experiences or signals to their software to get them to do what we want them to do. We're motivating the cells as cognitive agents. We're not trying to micromanage or force their behavior, which is quite hard. So that's one approach. The other approach, even more along those lines, is to take very seriously the idea that these tissues are cognitive agents, and basically to provide rewards and punishments. And this is it sounds kind of like a weird idea, but basically almost everything in biology is able to learn from experience and try to improve its life by doing things that bring it rewards. And so we are developing technologies where we can literally use tissue training as a kind of instrumental learning paradigm to reward tissues for the growth and physiology that we like, and away from disease states, and trying to take advantage of the learning and cognitive capacity of the electrical and chemical networks that live in not only brain tissue but also actually in all cell types.
That's super fascinating. And I'm concerned about micromanaging. If you assume that you have a wrong memory and these living cells will be autonomously navigated inside our body for finding a tumor, so how you make sure in this scenario of failure? I'm just curious because I don't have the experience in biology, but this is really curious how if you have like the wrong memory or you equipped with the wrong data, how they can recorrect it. It's conscious. I don't know. It's really how it's intelligent. It this living cell.
Yeah, well, intelligent in the sense that they're able to flexibly change their behavior to solve particular problems and reduce their stress. And so I think all cells and tissues have this capacity. How we control it? I mean, in the case of cancer, the simplest thing to do, we think, is to reconnect the cells electrically to their neighbors. I mean, one of the first things that happens during carcinogenic transformation is that cells lose electrical coupling to their neighbors. And when they do that, they basically shrink their computational boundary from previously being quite a large network that could have large-scale goals and have large-scale memories about what it was supposed to build. Now, all of that is very small. It is down to the surface of a single cell, and in that case, the cell basically becomes an amoeba. The boundary between self and world shrinks. The cell begins to treat the rest of the body as just outside environment, and it goes around, does what it wants, meaning it proliferates, it crawls wherever it wants. That's metastasis. So our strategy number one, I think the easiest strategy is going to be to force transform cells to reconnect electrically with their neighbors, and we've had some success with this in the frog model, and we're currently trying this with human cells to basically artificially force cells to be in electrical connection with their neighbors, at which point they become part of patterning collective, and they work towards normal physiology and normal normal organogenesis, despite the fact that they have maybe strong oncogene expression or mutations, whatever. It looks like that works pretty well, actually. So that is our approach right now.
Yeah, and here is a question, because some other groups working on using like microswimmer, they're developed by using wireless magnetic control. If we have a comparison, I don't know if we can compare Xenobots, if cancer treatment with microswimmers that's controlled by using wireless magnetic control. Can you compare what's differentiates Xenobot from these approaches?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. There are some fundamental differences. So there have been some really nice advances. I know from MIT, from Harvard, there have been groups that have made these basically 3D printed structures on which they culture muscle cells, and they can activate those muscle cells either optogenetically or electrically or whatever. The difference there is that is extremely bottom up engineering. You as the engineer are responsible for putting in everything that this thing is going to do. In other words, you have to design the 3D printed structure. You have to understand its mechanics. You know exactly where the force is going to be generated. You lay down the cells. This is you have to control every bit of it, and what you will get is a clear function of how well you predicted and understood what this thing is supposed to be doing. Our Xenobots are an entirely different scenario, because what we are trying to do is to exploit the natural plasticity of the cells and their capacity to join together to have specific goals. So in the end, we want to manipulate those goals, and we do want to be able to program the collective to do useful things and to have desired patterns. But fundamentally, what we are exploiting is the cell's internal intelligence and all the software inside of cells that allows them to work together as a group. So we do not tell those cells how to talk to each other. We do not tell them what to say. We do not tell them how to rearrange themselves. All of this happens naturally. We sculpt in this one paper. We sculpted them a bit at the end to according to the computer predictions, just to show that we have some understanding of what they're doing. But fundamentally, ours is an extremely emergent approach, whereby we do not want to micromanage, and we don't want to 3D print anything. We are not trying to lay down specific cell types and specific arrangements. What we want to do is to take advantage of the cell's natural built-in capacity for cooperation towards specific outcomes, and we would like to motivate the cells with inputs and signals to do what we want them to do during patterning. Basically, the way that the same way that complex bodies are created. We do not want to micromanage it, and the reason that's important, I mean, obviously, there's room in this field for every kind of approach, and it's great that people are doing the bottom up stuff. It's exciting work. What I think the advantage of doing it our way is that fundamentally, if you think about the future, let's say just in the biomedical area, people are working on stem cell biology, and so let's say, for example, that the goals of stem cell biology are achieved, and you can make any cell type you want out of a single cell. Okay, so let's say that's solved. Fine. Now somebody loses their arm, and now what? Because there's basically no hope of micromanaging the construction of, let's say, a human arm or an eye or anything complex out of individual stem cells. It's going to be too complicated. And so I think we really need to understand the processes of morphogenesis and self-assembly, and the motivation, why cells build one thing rather than another thing, is critical, because controlling it top down at that level is going to be way easier to achieve effects than trying to build it from scratch, at least in complex cases. Certainly for making things like bladders and simple things, it'll be fine to bioengineer directly.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I really like this point about understanding. And when we have this kind of discussion, since soft robotics is just we use smart material, and we have like shortage in understanding how the material behave. Back into this one, and you also lab that truly understanding and exploiting the morphogenetic code, especially high regulative aspects, require us to understand not only molecules and genes involved, but also algorithms and computation. And concerning this code in your lab, that I would like to ask you how this AI algorithm, the design, is have to like understand like every single detail of the cells, the models, because most of models like black box models, So I don't know how to which level it's really important to understand these cells. It is like you have to fully understand them, or just certain pattern or aspect of them in the model to predict which percentage, like skin cells and heart cells, to make this movement. How
Yeah.
is this figure out?
That's a good question, and I think the full answer to that will only be known in time. But my opinion right now is that we actually do not need to understand a large number of the details, because a lot of the implementation details are irrelevant to the key dynamics that are responsible for this process. So what we really need to understand is how much communication is there between the cells, what are they saying to each other, what is the control flow of the algorithm? What are they minimizing? What are they maximizing? These kinds of things. So we use a lot of concepts from information theory, from cognitive science, where people talk about minimization of surprise and info taxes, or the greediness for information, and systems that take measurements, homeostatic loops. All of these things are, I think, the real pieces that we need are at the level of cybernetics and information theory, not at the level of molecular biology. I mean, it's very nice to know the molecular biology mechanisms, and especially those are useful when we try to manipulate the system, because that's what our control knobs are going to be. But the reality is, biology varies the details very widely.
Yeah.
And in fact, I mean, I'm not a zoologist. I'm not tied to very specific living forms that we have here. I would like to understand life more broadly, and this ties to the field of artificial life and the question of life as it could be. So we're going to find either with synthetic life, or with AI, or with exobiology, with life on outside this planet, we are going to find examples of living things that use completely different underlying mechanisms. And so I think what we need to be doing is not tied exclusively to the details of how cells do this, but what are they actually doing, and what computational and informational tasks are they solving? And I think computer science and robotics understands this very clearly, that there's a kind of implementation independence, where you can study the algorithm without caring particularly much how it's implemented. Biology has still not largely made its way into that level of advance, I think, because mostly almost everybody's exclusively working on programming at the hardware level. They're thinking about rewiring the pathways, genomic editing. All of these things are kind of like how we programmed in the 40s, where to program a computer, you literally had to move wires around. And we have to move from that into a focus on the software, where we accept that the hardware is good enough, it's reprogrammable. We need to find whatever the native subroutines are and learn to use it, and be able to export those insights into biological and also non-biological hardware that's completely different in terms of the details. But what's going to be common are things like infotaxis, things like strategies for information measurement and sharing in a swarm, goal-directed homeostatic processes, where every layer has its own local set of goals. That sort of thing, I think, is much more fundamental.
Yeah. And concerning simulation, because if you go into a larger scale, do you think that simulation, how much, I don't know, how much accuracy comparing to what if you have simulation about Xenobots at larger scale and comparing to the real life? Do you think that something is really captured, and that's why I don't know how much really accuracy you have in simulated swarm of Xenobots before going to creating them and coming up with fabrication techniques, because it takes time, as you said.
Yeah, the simulator. I mean, this is really the Bongard Lab kind of expertise, but the simulator is actually quite good. And the important thing is that I think, as we just talked about, I don't think you have to simulate every tiny detail. I think you just have to capture the large scale control policies of the individuals, and how they add up to the swarm. Because in our case, we captured, I mean, from the let's say molecular biology point of view, we captured almost none of the realities of frog cells, and yet our predictive value for being able to make structures that do exactly what we thought they were going to do would turn out to be very high. And I think that's the lesson for us right there, is that you don't need to know or to model every single detail in order to have good predictive value. You have to be modeling it at the correct level, and I think we've identified the correct level.
So if I ask you, what is the most misconception that you received about Xenobots, because it had a lot of attention, but do you think this misconceptions maybe you saw about Xenobots when people receive it?
Yeah, the biggest. There have been a number of them. I think the single biggest misconception I think is that people generally assume that the big advance here is that we're going to have tiny robots for very specific tasks, and this is true. We are going to have tiny robots for specific tasks, but I think this is by far not the point here. I think the reason that I believe this is a fairly transformative technology is for what it's going to tell us about systems that range from whole societies to cities, power grids, communication networks, to tumors, cells in the body. I mean, it's a pervasive. The scaling of goals from simple agents to swarms of them is pervasive, and I think the impact of this is going to be huge and way beyond anything having to do with small frog robots. Another thing that people often jump to immediately is some sort of risk assessment, and in the sense that they're worried about the potential misuses of this technology. And I think the reason this is and not that we shouldn't. I mean, for any technology, you want to think about what the consequences are going to be. But I think the biggest gap I see in the reasoning of people about this problem is that they always sort of try to think about what are the potential downsides of going forward in this direction of research, but people almost never think about the opportunity cost of what happens if you don't do it. So people kind of assume that everything will go well, and that in general, and then we have the potential to screw it up with various dangerous types of research. But that actually isn't the case. I think that without a proper understanding of how to program swarms and how to predict the goals and behaviors of these kinds of systems, we are going to be in big trouble for many reasons. As a society, and I think it's essential to do this work and to do it quickly and at scale to really understand how it is that we can predict, control, and motivate swarms of intelligent agents, both in the body and without, because the consequences of not doing that, in terms of human suffering, both from disease and then various technological and environmental problems, is going to be enormous. I think if we're going to survive as a society, we absolutely have to do this. So what I would like people to do is, when they do this kind of calculus, is to really think about what's going to happen if we remain ignorant about where goals come from and how we were actually going to make good on the promises of regenerative medicine that we've been told for so long by people working on stem cells and genomics and so on.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting point, and I would like to ask you, since this is soft robotics in general is interdisciplinary field, and when we have the robots, it's just like a new way to think about living robot, because it's just something completely new for our understanding. And I would like to ask you, when you work in this project, do you think there's like kind of speaking different languages from biology to robotics, because you have the background in computer science, that's why it make be easier. But do you think when you're reading the projects done so far, do you think there's lack of understanding, or you are not satisfied what is direction of research is going? Because I think you're more driven and the team to help in having something helpful one day from the robots. How do you read this uh, stride is research, integrating different discipline to come up with new projects?
Yeah, I think there are absolutely differences in how the various subfields view things, and oftentimes the communication is very non-trivial. But we have here a great team, the Bongard Lab, and we have been working together for a while. We get along very well. We speak a lot of the same kinds of languages in terms of what it is that we're trying to achieve. And more broadly, when I give talks, I always try to talk to a very diverse range of audiences. So I give talks to computer scientists and roboticists, but also to cancer medicine folks and people in regeneration and molecular developmental biology, evolution, cognitive science. I talk to basal cognition, audiences and so on. And I really try to weave all this stuff together, because I think increasingly in science and technology, the problems that could have been solved as tiny sort of separate subfields, those are all gone. The remaining big problems that are facing us are all very multidisciplinary issues that don't obey the kind of convenient categories that human scientists have set up over the last couple of hundred years. And so I think it's up to us now to learn to work together to address these things and import the deep ideas from other fields. So I work very hard in my lab to make sure that the biologists are getting the benefit of some deep ideas from robotics and computer science, and conversely, I try to get the computational folks to really take on board what the biology is telling them, which in many cases is a very different way of thinking. Biology is fundamentally noisy. Everything is made of unreliable parts. I mean, parts that are guaranteed to break down quickly. A very different strategy from how engineers normally build things. And so it's important to not just have the computer scientists learn a bunch of genetics jargon or learn about chemical pathways. It's important for them to really understand how biological systems solve problems and do things, because it's very different. And likewise for the biologists to learn the deep insights of what is software and hardware really, what does it mean, and these kinds of things. And that's I work very hard to do that within my group, and then to publish reviews and to give talks that try to bring these things together.
Yeah, yeah. So, do you expect, how many years does it take to achieve the goal that you expected from Xenobots? Is something you can predict how many years?
Predicting years on anything is kind of the worst thing any scientist can do. So no, I can't give you any believable real timeline. But also, it really depends on what you mean by goals. If we're talking about having a Xenobot that does something useful, I think we're a small handful of years away from that. I think if we're talking about fully understanding what's going on here to revolutionize all of biomedicine, which I think is the ultimate goal, I think that's going to take decades. But I think I hope I will live to see it, and I think most of us listening to this will in fact live to see it. So so that's about as close as I can get on the temporal prediction.
I'm curious to ask you concerning, because the pain and emotion is kind, because there's some researchers designing robots that can feel pain, and this is kind of maybe hoax title, because we don't know, is this like a fake emotion. And I would like to ask you to think integrating emotion in Xenobot's future, like to feel the pain, or of like patient has the pain, and they can like predict, oh, you can feel this pain, or this kind of scenario. Do you imagine this something can be integrated and incorporated in living cell to feel the pain?
Well, the thing to do here is to back up and realize that we don't actually have any good understanding whatsoever of what those words mean. Beside our own first person experience. I mean, what you're really talking about is the whole problem of conscious experience.
Yeah.
And there are lots of people that study that try to study consciousness. What they're usually studying is either correlates of consciousness, so some kind of behavior or neural state that they think goes along with various conscious states, or they're making claims about something that some kind of publicly observable behavior that they think indicates the presence of consciousness. But we actually have no idea what it means for any other system besides ourselves to have an experience. And this is something that's fundamental. People argue about this in the philosophy of mind all the time. I don't think this kind of work in particular is going to crack that problem. The only thing that I do know is that I think this idea of real pain and fake pain is as binary categories. I think that's wrong. I think consciousness is a continuum, and I think that inevitably, when you break down a conscious system, you find nothing but physics. And so you have very simple physical systems like cuckoo clocks, where you really don't think there's much of an internal perspective there. I don't think there's any reason to think that a simple mechanism like that would have a internal what does it feel like to be me kind of a consciousness, whether it's pain or pleasure or whatever. But then you have humans, but then of course you have this long smooth continuum in between. And I don't think consciousness of pain or anything else is something that appears as a binary. It wasn't there, but now bang, it's here, and now it's real, and everything before that was just mechanism. I don't think there's any such magic line. I think it increases slowly. So there are probably amoebas that feel some degree of true pain when things go wrong for them, and their physiological and homeostatic parameters are completely out of whack. And then you have more and more complex sets of internal states that eventually you get to a really complex one, like a human that can actually report it and talk to you about it and tell you how they feel. But trying to build that in is very unclear what it is exactly that you're trying to build in. And when I have two kids, and when my son was about probably 6, he said to me he wanted to make a robotic cat, and I said, fine, let's design, let's make a design spec. What is it going to do? And he said, well, it has to move around and it has to look for food. And I said, yeah, well, we could probably do that. And he said, and then it has to care. And I said, well, what do you mean? You mean it has to come up to you and want you to pet it? He said, no, that's not pretend to care. We have to make it actually care. And then I said, okay, well, now this whole project is just blown up because we can't do it, because we have absolutely no idea of what it means for anything to actually care, because all we're going to do is build in a set of responses to various things that will avoid things that we think cats don't like and so on. But at what point does that become actual caring? I mean, at some point it must, because that's how all living things are put together. I don't think there's any magic about it, but we actually have no idea what that ingredient is. And so I think all of these questions of putting in internal perspective, consciousness, anything else into our creations really has to rest on trying to understand what that actually is in the first place. And that's a very contentious issue that's not resolved.
Yeah, that's very interesting one. I think this is about physical reasoning and psychological reasoning, and that's why maybe you highlight by psychological, we don't understand so much. Yeah. So if I ask you what is the most challenging part in that you expect in this project of Xenobot, is it, of course, I'll let fabrication one issue, but when you look deeper and sometimes you like reflect what's could be the most challenging, upcoming challenging part, what it could be from, do you think?
Oh, I think the all of the mechanical stuff, the fabrication, the molecular biology, the characterization, all of that, those are not the difficult part. I mean, they're challenging, obviously, but that's not the fundamental difficult part.
Okay.
The fundamentally difficult part is really cracking this scale up of cognition. Really understanding on a conceptual level how best to model how local goals of many individual agents add up to a large-scale goal of one integrated, coherent agent. This is the problem of developmental biology. It's the problem of cognitive science and psychology. It is a very deep and fundamental problem that pervades a lot of other sciences and technologies. And that is going to be the hard part. The scale up of cognitive capacity and is really going to be the big advance.
Yeah. So, concerning the ethics and regulation, do you think that Xenobots now really deserve that kind of talks about ethics and regulation, or still too early to consider this now? The ethics and regulation.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. In general, so let's just lay down the fundamental assumptions. I think in general, every living thing deserves some degree of respect, proportionate to the capacity of that thing to have some sort of conscious experience, right? So it's a continuum, and we already have a huge number of regulations. Especially as scientists, we have a huge number of regulations that tell us what we can and cannot do in the name of progress to various models of living things. So in order for a biologist to do an experiment in the lab that is pretty equivalent to what normal people do when they go fishing, we have to fill out a bunch of forms and wait months for a panel of veterinarians and ethicists to look at this and to tell us whether this is okay or not. So there already is and there should be a very coherent structure in place for protecting living things under experimentation. So I will say first that I think that's exactly how it should be. That's appropriate, and living things deserve respect. Having said that, I think we need to really think about these things in the global context of what else is happening in today in society. So people have talked to me about the fact that they feel bad for these Xenobots, and we've created these organisms. But inevitably, when I ask people whether they eat meat, they say yes. And then I ask them if they know where hamburgers come from. And as a society, we already have massive problems with the mistreatment of animals that for sure are some kind of an agent that deserves respect. So we have large mammals, adult mammals that are being used for food. So I would say until we resolve those kind of issues and factory farming and everything else, worrying about frog skin, I think, is so far down on the list that it's kind of laughable to worry about that issue while these other things are going on. So I think fundamentally, we absolutely have to think about the welfare of our creations. That is always the case. But we need to have a list that is ordered in some logical fashion, where we spend the most amount of time worrying about the biggest problems and then work our way down the list. And I think these things are way down on the list of ethical problems that we have today with mistreatment of various living creatures.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And here's a question, because we ask this question all the time: how we can make sure that develop robots, soft robotics, or whatever cellular robots in the future beneficial to humanity as a whole? How we can make sure that like these questions apply to what we do in our academia industry? How we can make sure this question is answered properly?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think we have to. There's a general version of this, and then there's a specific version about these bots. The general version is for any scientist. When you think about how do I make sure that my invention is used for good instead of evil, fundamentally, I think that's an unsolvable problem. I mean, fire, stone tools, sticks, any of these things that were a tremendous, life improving invention from day one of humanity has been used for good things, and it's been misused. And I think humans are ingenious, and I think no matter what you invent that is of benefit to mankind, somebody somewhere is going to figure out some way to do something bad with it. And I think our goal as a society should be to really foster the positive uses and make sure that we are ready to really understand all the ways that these things can go wrong, any kind of unintended consequence, and also targeted misuse by people who are not going to care about regulations. I mean, in this case, okay, regulations are fine, but as often happens, the only ones paying attention to the regulations are going to be the people you're not worried about anyway. The people who you are worried about, everything from terrorists to people doing synthetic biology in their garage, are not going to care at all about any regulations that anybody else puts out. So regulations are only, I think, a part of the problem. The bigger thing is that we really have to, as a community, understand how this technology works and what is going to be what are going to be countermeasures if and when something goes wrong. And this has been the case for bacteriology. It's been the case for virology. It's been the case for any other technology that the reason we study horrible infectious diseases is because we know that no matter what we do, either naturally or by design, there are going to be epidemics, there are going to be nasty diseases spreading around, and the best thing we can do is understand how they work and advance the field so that we have proper countermeasures. I think really moving the research and the science forward is our only defense against unintended consequences and against misuse of these things. We just have to know how they work. Putting our head in the sand and pretending this will never be an issue is not going to do it.
So, do you think universities and research group and funding agency combine knowledge and solution? Because it's an issue sometimes you have the funding and you have to write a proposal of what you do. And sometimes, as I see in Xenobot, there's a real passion to develop scientific breakthrough. How do you read this kind of uh, funding in universities dealing with this knowledge, or just having solution at the end of this project? How do you see that?
I'm not sure in this. I mean, I don't know. I think that obviously there's a lot of interest in this work. I think certainly funding bodies will be having programs. I mean, some of them already do, and there will be more. Institutions are obviously involved in supporting this kind of work. There are lots of centers now popping up for this kind of new synthetic morphology and biorobotics. Yeah, I think it's only going to expand. And the big difficulty is having funding bodies that understand the basic principles involved here and that are willing to pay for very fundamental work. I think it's not too hard to get a grant for a very specific biomedical application, let's say, or some sort of robot that's immediately useful. You can get money from industry and so on. But getting money for these basic conceptual frameworks for really understanding what's going on here in a very interdisciplinary way involving cognitive science and information theory and everything else, that is still lagging very far behind, and it always has for deep questions are hard to get money to study, and there are only a few private foundations really that specifically address that need.
Yeah. So I would like to ask you where innovation comes from. The innovation.
Innovation, where does it come from? Well, I'm not exactly sure where innovation comes from, but new ideas, I think, come from thinking about problems in novel ways. And I think what really helps that is having material from other fields, meaning being informed about how people think about things in other fields, and thinking and reading very very broadly, and being educated in a wide range of subjects, and not being overly narrow. And I suppose there are structures that can facilitate that by bringing together people in different fields and actually encouraging deep collaboration, and then supporting work at a very early stage where it's still unclear what the product or what the kind of application is going to be, but fundamental questions. I think places that encourage that kind of basic exploration and really encourage people to ask novel, difficult, and interdisciplinary questions are going to be the hotbeds of innovation. And I think that's pretty critical for moving forward on these difficult issues.
Yeah. So do you think ego is important for the researcher?
Do I think what?
Ego.
Ego?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I've certainly run into a lot of researchers where for them it has been a major driver, and I think a lot of people are very motivated by this kind of ego-centered set of drives, where they want to be the best they can be and be perhaps rise above the status quo and the standard in the field, and sort of stand out. So I think it can be a driver for some people. I've seen that go well, and I've seen it go poorly. We all know cases where that kind of thing is overdone and sort of causes more harm than good. But for some people that works well, and I also know other people that are incredibly talented, innovative researchers that have very little ego involvement. And so I don't think it's required, but I think it is common in our field.
Mm-hmm. And I would like to ask you if you have any robots at your home. Do you have any robots?
Robots in the home? Not the standard kind of robots. We don't have any real robotics in terms of Alexas or anything like that. No.
Okay, so I would like to ask you, what is the most inspiring book you have ever read?
The most inspiring book, boy, that's difficult. I have a few favorites. One of them is Hofstadter's Gödel Escher Bach. That one was a major inspiration. Another one that really put me on the road to a lot of these things, and I came across it when I was about 17, was Robert Becker's The Body Electric. And it really was foundational in how I thought about biological systems. I think those two are probably the ones that I can think of right off the top of my head. But there have been many that we have. In fact, in my lab, I have this thing in the hallway called the Wall of Heroes, and it's just basically about a dozen of old photographs of people that have inspired my thinking, and most of them have written books, and I'm sure there would be some good ones there.
Yeah. Thank you. Wish for the humanity in the next 100 years.
For humanity in the next 100 years, boy, that's not a trivial question. I think what I would like is to finally gain control over growth and form. And what I mean by that is basically to resolve issues of the structure and health of the body. I think that once we understand how to manipulate three-dimensional living tissue, we're going to do away with concepts of disease, aging, degenerative disease, decline, these kinds of things. And at that point, basically, I mean, you said 100 years, so I'm sort of thinking way forward. I think what we need to do is to go beyond the limitations of the physical body that we happen to have been handed by evolution, and just sort of transcend those kind of limitations and really start to work on the things that matter, which are various advances
Yeah.
in the cognitive sphere that are currently we are all limited. I mean, we all get older, we all get distracted from our work by various things that happen to us, and a lot of it is randomness, a lot of it is chance, and a lot of it is through ignorance. You know, things happen because we don't know how to prevent it, we don't know how to treat it. It's really completely in the grand scheme of things, it's unnecessary. If we knew what we were doing with biology, all of that could go away, and we could really do some incredible things. And I think that's what I would like to see.
Yeah. And lastly, what is the best advice was given to you with a in personal and professional life, and you would like to share with audience?
The best advice. I think the best advice is probably the opposite of the worst advice that I've gotten, and the worst advice I've gotten very consistently, which is focus, focus, focus. That I think is the advice that most of us get in this field, is to really focus very narrowly and drill down and go extremely deep. And I think it's nice to go deep, but I think it's really important to also understand the broader picture and why you're doing it and what it really means in the grand scheme of things. And so, what I would say is, don't forget to broaden out every once in a while. It can't all be drill down. You've got to go broader as well. And I think thinking deeply and not taking too seriously the advice of sort of meta advice from other people. You know, people that are very successful in their field, but they may know. And this, I tell this to my students all the time when they leave the lab. I said, look, there are lots of really talented, successful people that are very well calibrated on their own work. They are not necessarily well calibrated on your work. So when they tell you that so and so is impossible, or it shouldn't be done, or it can't be done, they don't necessarily know what they're talking about. And so what you need to do is what I think everybody needs to do is build up their own intuition and know what they're talking about in their field, and then go for it despite what anybody's telling them about what is or is not a good idea. You know, you need to develop your own sense of how far to chase something, and how to balance risk reward ratios on crazy ideas and things like this. Everybody has their own set point, and you really have to develop your own. You can't rely on anybody else to do it for you.
That's very good advice. And finally, do you have any final words you would like to share for the robotics community?
Not really. Only to say that I think it's a great community. It's one of the most open-minded. You know, I give my talk to different kinds of communities. I can always judge by how they respond to novel ideas that may counteract things that are or contradict things that are accepted in their world. And some communities are very traditional and very have a lot of resistance to new ideas, and others are not. And I think that computer engineers in general and roboticists in particular are very open and are a great community. It's one of my favorite audiences to talk to.
Thanks so much. At the end of the podcast, on behalf of IEEE RS of Robotics, I would like to thank you for your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.